What's up, y'all? Y'all tuned in to the Funk
Hey,
Geeks.
what's happening funky? We keeping it funky with y'all on this lovely day. What day is it today?
Today is the day. It don't matter what day it is, cause every day is a good day.
It's a good
When you
day,
talking
y'all.
about the zap.
Zapp Roger.
Today on the Funk Geeks, we are gonna discuss the debut album of Zapp,
Zapp
known
Roger.
as Zapp.
Who do we credit for a lot of these joints? It's hard. What did Zapp do? What did Roger do?
How about we credit Bootsy Collins first?
Oh, go.
All right. Well, before we get into that, this album was released July 28th, 1980, which makes this officially the oldest album that we have ever done a retrospective on.
Mm.
That means this album was released 40 years ago.
Shout out to all the uncles right now that grew up on this joint.
And if you did have an uncle that grew up on this joint, you got a cool uncle.
Yeah, man. No suit and tie for that fool. That fool was kicking it. That fool was driving down PCH with the top down, bumping
With the
this
perm
with the perm with his lady in the passenger seat. They weren't
or ladies.
or ladies in the back. You know what I mean? What car? What car are they driving, Sean? El
They're
Camino?
probably
No,
not at all. Not at all. They're driving
Chevy,
a Lincoln Navigator.
Lincoln Navigator, huh? Hell nah, shut the fuck up. Now they are probably because they got a whole family. They got a family. They're ordering drive through, listening to Zapp and Roger.
Well, let's get this straight. Zapp is a group from Dayton, Ohio, and they're pretty much known as the guys who created electro funk, so to speak.
Mm.
And I thought about this, and today we're reviewing their first debut album, which is kind of the first electro funk album. And the reason why we're talking about it is because this album, whether you know it or not, and I don't think a lot of hip hop heads know this,
Hip hop.
this is one of the most important records ever made in terms of
Yes.
the sound of hip hop and where it eventually goes 10 years later, 20 years later, even till now. Let's just say there'd be no YG, there'd be no Dr. Dre, there'd be no Snoop Dogg, there'd be no Ice Cube
Quick.
if this album wasn't made.
Right. There wouldn't be a lot of people. There wouldn't even be dances if not for this music. There wouldn't be specific dances if not for this music. The grooves on this album and albums that follow is pretty much set a whole foundation for whole subgenres of hip hop, right? Like, not too many songs do that. And we can pinpoint one particular joint that pretty much is the branch off of the hip hop tree.
Right. And we're going to get to that. So the first thing is to talk about who Zapp is, right? Like when we think about Zapp, we do think of a band, but really the cornerstone, the epicenter of Zapp was Roger Troutman,
Okay.
which is why we say Zapp and Roger or Roger and Zapp, right? Because really the what Roger okay, first of all, Roger Troutman was the primary vocalist of Zapp. He also played the guitar, he also played the keyboard, and his number one contribution to maybe music as a whole is the talk box,
Yep. Yep.
right?
Okay. So you're crediting Roger for the performance or the composition of this music, or both?
Both.
Both.
Although I tried to find live performances of Zapp, and although I saw a couple of videos and it was electric and it was great, I'm surprised I can't find more. The main thing that I wanted to ask you coming to this is how come Zapp never got the kind of credit that maybe a Parliament got, that George Clinton got? That how come we don't put him in the same light as how come we don't
Mm,
see Roger Troutman as a prince like figure
right.
in terms of what he brought to the table?
My theory on that, and that's a good ass question. But my theory on that is Zapp might have been very pop. Out of all of the different funk subgenres, Zapp was very pop, and P Funk was still kind of low key. I mean, it's psychedelic. That's never pop. Nothing psychedelic is pop, and anything that Prince does, he's never gonna come with some anything that you can expect. And so that's why I think, as far as public accreditation goes, people are it's a lot cooler, right? It's more cooler to highlight the underground scenes, and so that's my theory on that.
Right. And the reason why Zap is so important is because the sound that was created on this album is the sound that went on to influence West Coast hip hop. Like, I people say G Funk, I say just West Coast hip hop. And I want to quote Ice Cube, who once said that the first time that he ever heard more bounce to the ounce, which is the primary track that got them famous as well as the first track on the album. He said, I was in the 6th grade. We'd stayed after school. We had this dude named Mr. Locke, and he used to bring in his radio with these pop lockers. He used to teach the dance group called the LA Lockers, and he would do community service and after school programs. He knew a lot of kids and introduced them all to the new dances, and he put on that song, More Bounce to the Ounce, and they just started pop locking. And from that visual, from seeing that, it was my first introduction to hip hop, period. I didn't know nothing about nothing. I didn't even heard Rapper's Delight yet. It was
Wow.
the first thing that was super fly to me. They started dancing and singing More Bounce, goes on forever, and they just got down. I think that was the rush of adrenaline for me, like a chemical reaction in my brain. And I will also say this. There's a scene in the movie Straight Outta Compton, which is the biopic they did on NWA, where you see Dr. Dre, or Dre at the time, he's doing some turntables in the very beginning, and he's playing Zap, and he's scratching to Zap. And I knew at that moment that there would be no West Coast hip hop scene if it wasn't for the music that Zapp made. Because that's what really defined the West Coast, was that they were funky, they went down, they were soulful, they were slower. Whereas the East Coast was more fast paced, very, very aligned with the Roland drum kits. And it was more, it wasn't as smooth, right?
Yeah, it was very harsh. It was do 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 do, like very
Yeah.
fast, very hard. And I mean, it probably is just a product of the environment. And that it's always wild to think of how the art reflects the lifestyle of the areas that it comes out of. A lot less lately because of just everything being globalized and stuff, but back then it really was a clear representation of the moods and vibes of the particular areas.
Right. And More Bounce to the Ounce, if we were just to really hone in on what I mean, the list is very long in terms of what this song has been sampled on. But if I'm going to maybe pick five, just five, you got California Love by Tupac and Dr. Dre. You've got Uptown Funk by Mark Ronson and Bruno Mars. You've got Going Back to Cali
Yeah,
by Notorious B.I.G. You got You Gots to Chill
yeah.
by EPMD. You have, I mean, it's
It goes
you
on.
have the end. You love to hate by Ice Cube. It's Snoop Dogg, MC. Lil Rob,
Yeah.
the guy from your hometown, San Diego's greatest contribution to hip hop,
Hello, you know what's up.
has sampled this. Maybe this is, to this date, one of the most sampled tracks ever made in hip hop. I want to ask you why.
Wow. Why? Why is it the most sampled track? Well, I think, see, here's my theory on that. Um that that groove, that sound, those that boom,
boom, boom,
boom,
boom, boom.
right? There's something about that, and it could be one in the tempo and just the feel of it, and it fits. It just fits that West Coast vibe, you know. And a lot of people back then, at least, they layered rhythms, right? They'll start off with this and then throw harder drums on top of that. And now you got a rap song, and it was just easy to do that. And so I mean, I wouldn't even doubt that people just looped that song over and over again, rapped, danced,
Hours for
hours.
hours.
Right, and like a lot of people that are making G funk today still sample the drums of that, mix it with maybe trap rhythms. You know what I mean? It's still influential to this day. But I got a couple percentages that I want to throw out there. Maybe just a couple numbers. But out of all of the top top five Zapp and Roger tracks that were sampled, that more bounce to the ounce, just freaking it's just so high because we're talking 305 samples total based on who sampled, and there's for sure more people who aren't famous that sampled that. So I'm gonna give a rough estimate of 500 songs have sampled this one song, and the next best song that we all know might be something like "Computer Love." That's only
Right.
100, dude. That's only 100 out of all of the 691 songs that they sampled. 305 is more bounce to the ounce alone. It's crazy.
Yeah, and I would say the on this album, the second song that's had maybe the most how can I say, like, most well known for the samples
What?
is Be Alright.
Yeah.
Just because of how famous Tupac is
Mm-hmm.
and that he sampled it for Keep Your Head Up,
Ooh.
which
Sorry.
and as well as PRT, we actually did do
Yeah.
an album review on Poor Righteous Teachers where we talked about the sample being used on this. But Tupac's Keep Your Head Up is is probably more famous
Right.
than
Right.
the original, but done executed extremely well. I mean, one thing I'll say is this album is impossible not to move to.
Yep.
It is infectiously
Yep.
good at putting grooves in your nervous system. And from the moment that you start it and you hear More Bounce to the Ounce to the second song, which is my favorite, Personal Freedom, Freedom, which is my personal favorite. And I'm trying to understand why that's the case. I try to understand why is this so physiologically invoking to me that I feel like I have to move. And I've come up with a couple things. I think the main one has got to be the bass guitar
Hmm.
because the bass guitar seems to me out of all these tracks to be the primary focus of not of funk music, but specifically their slap in the bass.
Yeah.
Their bass
Mhm.
slapping.
That last song that you just talked about, what was it called? Freedom. That one
Freedom.
that got that slap bass to it. But then other joints has a synthesized bass, right? Bow,
Right.
like just stuff like that. But for that particular song, when we were listening to it before the show, man, it's funky, man. That was the first thing I thought about, man. That's the first thing you feel as soon as it drops.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure either Funky Bounce or Brand New Player also implements that slap bass where and not just slapping it, but pulling the bass as well. And when you hear a real bass guitar, you just can't help it. You just it drives deep inside of you to groove, and I think that's really the element of all what you call G funk or funk inspired music is the advent of the bass guitar. And so that's my theory on why this stuff is so funky. But even though you mentioned earlier, I know you said that Zapp was maybe a little bit more pop, and I can understand where I would think that in the 1980s, if you went out to a club in Compton, they're probably gonna play this. They're
Yep.
probably gonna play Zapp, right? And especially a kind of club where people have their hair perms, they're wearing leather jackets, they're wearing boots, they're colorful, a lot of purple. They're all trying to look a little bit like Prince. I would think that Zapp was probably the main soundtrack of those nights. But but with that being said, this to me, whenever I hear it, it doesn't, I don't think pop. I just think this is the funkiest piece of music I've maybe heard in my life. It's the epitome of funk. And so when you say that, like, what's the alternative to this, right? If this is the pop version of punk, what is true funk? Are you gonna say it's James Brown? Are you gonna say
Well,
it's Ohio Players? Who is it?
well, I don't know if I could put one person on it, but here's another side of G Funk. Regulate, Warren G.
Right.
That is still funky in essence, but it has a very different vibe to it, right? I mean, I don't know if I can explain the difference, but it is on the cooler side of things. This is red hot. These
Right.
rhythms are red hot, but then you move over to a Warren G, that style of G funk, just more cool, smooth, Nate Dogg. You know, the samples they use on that side of things, it's more chill. It's more on the blue side, right? So, um, I don't know. I don't know if I have an answer for that question, bro.
Yeah, because my question, if it's not, because Zapp is a 1980s band,
Yep.
and funk gets associated a lot with the 60s and the 70s, like James Brown, Sly and the
I thought that
Family
was disco
Stone,
era. I mean, but for sure, the overlap is
right?
strong.
George Clinton, and the thing is, we know for a fact that because two Parliament members, and if we want to say that Parliament Funkadelic is the synthesis of what funk music is. Well, you got Bootsy Collins
Yep.
and you got George Clinton lending their services to the album. Specifically, you've got Bootsy Collins on the guitars for this whole entire album. And even though this is Roger Troutman's band, you can't deny that the Parliament influence is there, but it's so much more refined than a Parliament album. It's so much less chaotic
Yeah.
and it's more synthesized, so to speak.
And that's what makes it pop. I think that's what makes anything popular is when shit gets cleaned up. This is, and then Bruno Mars will take the same rhythm but make it even cleaner. You know what I mean? Like
Right.
and Mark Ronson and all those cats, right? They make really clean funk. But then you got people like kind of Chromeo that are still trying to reproduce this sound, but make it. I think they can be a little psychedelic the way they manipulate the synthesizers and stuff. But uh, I think yeah, man. The difference between the two is exactly punk and pop, and it should be there should be space for both of those sounds.
Yeah, and I feel like if you take someone like the Free Nationals,
Mm-hmm.
they
Mm-hmm.
really represent that inside middle man between the pop side of funk and the punk side
Mm.
of funk. And like as I was listening to this, I was like, man, imagine we put Thundercat
Mm-hmm.
and Anderson Pack on this. It would be modern.
Yep.
There's nothing like when I listen to this, it there's no sense of outdated to me. Maybe
Right.
aside from the last track, which is Coming Home, which almost has a little bit of a country type of vibe to it. And I don't mean country in the sense of modern country, but I mean just it feels bluesy,
Right.
right? It's in that and country is very much inspired by blues. So that's where I feel like the first 5 tracks on this, I mean, they're still being sampled to this date. When I hear YG, because I think to me YG is the rapper that kind of most epitomizes what the West Coast G Funk sound would be modernized because he still continues to make that kind of music. There's no doubt in my mind that Zapp played a role in what he does today.
Right. I actually got to ask you a question, and I don't know if there is a real answer for this, but since you're a rhythm guy, I want to ask you between the bass guitar or any kind of bass instrumentation on a funk song versus the drums, what do you think makes for a stronger funk song? A strong bass groove or a strong just rhythm from the percussion?
Well, okay, I'll answer your question. The first thing is we know that specifically the drums on this album, they're not like normal. They're not, it's not it doesn't it's a drum kit, right? Let's just say that for sure. It's a drum kit. And on top of that, the snares, they're not they're just they're pinching snares,
Mm.
right? Like the moment the snare hits, it's a very high altitude tone.
Break your
They're
neck.
not
They snap.
hollow.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a snap. It's a very snappy kind of snare, and it hits you.
Yeah.
And and here's the thing: we're talking about the 1980s, so the idea of 808s being the predominant rhythm supplier on the low frequency isn't there yet. So, what is the primary rhythm supplier of the low frequency? It's gonna be the bass guitar.
Yep.
So to me, and I heard a Thundercat interview where he explained this very well. He said the beauty of the bass guitar and why it's kind of sad. It's sad today that it may be in modern hip hop, aside from YG, you don't hear the bass guitar as frequently as you did before because the bass guitar was in charge of blending the rhythm and the melody together harmoniously.
Absolutely.
And that's why if you listen to rock music, right? If you listen to bands, the bass guitarist, his job isn't it okay, is to keep rhythm.
Mm.
The drummer's job is not to keep rhythm. The drummer's job is to keep tempo.
Mm-hmm.
So the drummer has to keep tempo,
Mm.
the bassist has to keep rhythm.
Yes,
And
God.
there's a difference.
Absolutely. Wow. That's it. That's it. That's a really good way to put it. I think as an with no drumming background, I can honestly say that I would give the job of keeping rhythm to the drums. That's just it felt natural to say something like that. But with what you just said,
In modern production, that is the case.
yeah, and here's the problem. Here's the reason why you can't have a lot of bass guitars is because that 808 today is takes up too much of the real estate on the frequency spectrum. It takes
Right.
way too much space. You just can't. You need a dry kick drum to fit a bass line on it. And there are a handful of cats that I think can masterfully mix today's drums with a bass line, and still have a big smacking kick and a bass line under it. I mean, I think of maybe like a King Kunta really had a hard bass to it and a bass line. Had some hard kicks to it and a bass line. Um, but it's not a lot of people that can really pull that off.
Yeah. So, for instance, talking about this relationship of the bass line versus the bass drum versus the low frequency, like for instance, you mentioned about how it has to be a dry bass, and just to explain to the listener what we mean by that, a watery bass, for instance, is something that's prolonged
Right.
and vibrating and shaking and that's what a watery bass is like. If you have a watery bass overlaid with the bass guitar is going to get completely consumed by the bass line. And so when you have music, that's why a lot of modern hip hop music, let's say for instance, I'm going to talk about Barker's favorite thing in the world to talk about, Bay Area hip hop.
Yee.
Bay Area hip hop, for instance, what instead of like you mentioned King Kunta, in King Kunta, they do have a bass guitar, but the actual low frequency kicks are maybe two notes, or maybe just two notes in variation. When you have Bay Area hip hop, right, we're talking, they're treating the bass kick, they're treating the kick as if it was supposed to be the bass guitar. So, boom, 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 boom. And then, for instance, like a Pilo or a Cool John or a I Am Sue, whatever you want to call this kind of music, they're taking the kick and they're treating the kick like there's variation within the rhythm and the melody. So it's responsible for both. And really, when we look at music like drum and bass music, there's no room for melody.
Nope.
There's too much real estate being taken up by the rhythm that's all you're gonna really have.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good way to put it. I think on a technical note, what they do, what somebody like a Pilo will do, will kind of take a just a real short kick, just a real short kick with a little bit of tonal qualities to it, and then we'll throw a bow. You know what I mean? It'll throw a synthesizer on there and then make a melody out of that with this kick that has a little bit of tonal qualities to it, but not too much because to prevent clashing frequencies between the synthesis and the kick. So that's kind of like the technique they use today to try to mix these bass lines with 808s, because you run into a lot of frequency clashing when you deal with all that low
But
frequency.
Roger Troutman does something similar to what you mentioned on the low frequency with the mid and the high, because he's vocalizing melody
Yeah.
through the talk box on top of him playing the melody on a Moog mini Moog,
Yep.
and then later a Yamaha DX100. So the guy is, in some sense, so that you have the bass guitar, which is playing this primary rhythm, you would say. So the bass guitar and the drums are trying to maintain this tempo and rhythm together. And then you have Roger Troutman, who is, he's not the harmony. He's not the primary melody, but he's the guy that's soloing it out on top, on the very top of everything. And that's why Roger Troutman has the freedom to do that, because he is in charge of what you would call, what do you call that in music? The guy, it's not the primary,
It's not the lead
but
synth or the lead
it's
melody.
not the lead. Yeah, it's not the lead melody, but it's the one that is given the most freedom for variation, and can come in and come out at any time.
Okay.
And that's what he was doing with the
Right.
talk box and the Moog. He was
Yeah.
saying, and that's why when you watch Zapp live, he's able to communicate with the crowd and then jump off and then get the talk box back in and play it with the Moog and get the crowd engaged with it.
Hmm. Yeah, I think. Oh, you know what? I think they do exactly what you just said. So they kind of treat the voice, because it is a talk box, to, as the song progresses, it might replace a bass line. So you gotta, I can make you dance, right? And so
Right.
he'd pretty much be doing what the bass guitar in that moment would be doing, and then you'll go through a couple bars of that, and then and then he switches off, goes to the high end of things, replace the low end with some bass in there. You know what I mean? And so now it creates this overall balanced tone within the music, and that's just masterful composition at at its best.
Right. And you know who to this date is being credited as the guy who made the voice the primary melody of a song? The guy who made the voice the instrument?
Hmm.
To me, Kanye West and Jay Dilla.
Treated their
They get
voice
the
as an
credit.
instrument.
They get the credit. They
Oh,
get the
okay.
credit.
I'm with you. I'm with you. The
They
way
get
they
the
sample,
credit.
right?
Right, the way they take a voice and make it an instrument, but Roger Troutman was doing it in every single song. So
Mm.
why does he not get that credit? And I know we do this a lot. I know we do this a lot where we talk about who gets credit and who doesn't. But we should definitely be giving Roger Troutman some clout, because the dude was literally using his voice as the primary melody when he wasn't singing. And if he was singing, he would match his singing with his synthesizer.
Right. No, you're absolutely right. And I think the reason why it was overlooked is because it doesn't feel the same. Roger isn't sampling anybody. This is him playing his voice, the instrument. Or the synthesizer, manipulating it with his mouth, right? That using that as the instrument, and having lyrics being part of the melody. Besides sampling, there wasn't many ways to do that successfully. I mean, vocoders come in the picture maybe. Shoot, man, I feel like vocoders came after the fact. That technology, no one really uses that much, in the hip hop world, at least. I think mainly in the EDM space, but to use a voice and lyrics, we all know the famous Kanye sample, right? The "Do the fire," right? So it's
Right.
like that was really the melody, but it becomes the chorus, sort of. It just doesn't feel the same as like a Roger Troutman. So I think that's why it's overlooked.
So what about cuz no one uses talk boxes anymore, but everyone has treated the Jay-Z wrote a song, it's called
A death of autotune.
The Death of Autotune. So what about T-Pain?
Yeah. So I
Cuz T-Pain treats his voice almost, he bumps the auto, and the dude can sing, we both know that. But he treats his voice and the way it's being auto-tuned like a talk box.
right. I wanted to mention him in the last question, but it is different compared to Kanye. But for this conversation, you could say that T-Pain treated the software like an instrument, as opposed to before that technology was used as a tool for engineers to make corrections. And so T-Pain used autotune incorrectly as an instrument in the same way acid house producers used the 303 incorrectly and made melodies from an instrument that was supposed to do something else. And so that's what T-Pain did here. It's almost not even the same conversation. A lot of people like to put the talk box autotune within the same conversation, and it is weird to me, maybe just because I do produce music, I understand it, but a lot of people get the two confused and really talk as if they're the same thing. But the usage but the application and the things you can do with autotune and talk boxes, very different. You cannot manipulate your voice in the same way you can in with a talk box like that you can with autotune. You know what I mean?
Okay, have you watched? I think it's a TikTok video of a guy saying Roddy Ricch is the
Yeah,
box, and he's doing it in a talk
yeah,
box, right?
yeah.
But the way he's using that talk box is the way that traditionally R&B singers use autotune. So maybe that's something unexplored.
I don't know what you mean by that. And so here's my confusion with your question is because, like, again, I'm looking at the two very separately. You treat When you're using autotune, you're using autotune as the instrument, as some sort of instrument. But when you're using talkbox, you're using the voice as the instrument. You know what I mean?
Okay.
It's different. The anchor point between the two are different. The anchor for the talk box is your mouth to manipulate the shape of the synthesizer, whereas autotune
I see.
is changing the shape
So
of the
so the
pitch.
talk box has to be inputted into a synthesizer. It's literally
Lit-
you have to play the synthesizer
yes,
on top of using the
manipulating
talk box.
your mouth.
I see.
Your mouth. Your mouth and the synth is how noise happens in a talk box thing. Whereas in an auto tune situation, your voice information into the software is the two you know things that matter.
So it's even more impressive then, because then we're seeing that Roger's able to use the talk box to manipulate his synthesizer and sing
Yep.
at the same
Yes.
time. So you're saying that's not the norm.
No, not at all. When you play talk box, you have to know the notes you're hitting, and that's one of the biggest difference. And actual, you have to be some sort of musician, or at least be familiar with how the how a keyboard works or a guitar to even play the talk box. You can't just come in there and make beautiful music.
Wow.
Whereas autotune
So
will
that
make you sound beautiful.
right, right. So understood. Understood. Wow. We covered a lot today. Today was probably one of our most technical uh, you know, retrospectives
Yeah, I think naturally,
we've ever done.
us being from the West Coast, I think this music pulls our heartstrings. Just growing up in the area, especially SoCal, I think it's a big part of our musical culture. So, shout out to Zapp Troutman and Roger Troutman. God bless the dead. Um, Actually, is Roger still alive? I know Zapp, but I forgot.
I think Roger passed away.
Man, yeah. God bless the dead, man. Shout out to them. Shout
Yeah.
out to Ohio. What I mean? Don't sleep on Ohio. This is it's just crazy. We don't think much about Ohio, but that region has created a genre and a lot of jobs for a lot of people. You know what I
Right. I
mean?
mean, Ohio players, man.
Yeah.
One of the all-time, and also from Dayton.
Straight up
There's
and down.
something about Dayton. I think there's something about Dayton.
Right? Right?
And that's funny cuz Dayton isn't really even a big city. Like it's like saying Fresno
Right.
here in California. So
And guess who else
there's
came from?
something in the water.
Guess who else came from Ohio?
Tell me.
Bow Wow.
Bow wow wow yippee yay yippee yay.
No, we're talking
Oh,
the
actual
Bow
bow
Wow
wow.
challenge. Lil Bow Wow. I think he's from Columbus or some shit. I don't know.
Okay, that made Ohio way less cool. Let's go back and say LeBron James. How about that? Let's say LeBron
All
James.
right,
I
all
feel
right.
better saying that. Yeah.
Akron? I forgot.
Akron, Ohio, right outside of Cleveland. But that's pretty much all I got. Do you have any last thoughts on Zapp 1980 debut album?
Nothing much. My favorite song is "More Bounce to the Ounce." I know it's basic, but it's man, that gets me every single time. Out of this particular album, that's my listen to that if you haven't already, and I doubt you haven't if you grew up in Cali.
Yeah, and definitely if you haven't heard the whole thing, this is a great one to buy on vinyl if you ever were interested in procuring a funk album for vinyl for scratching or for sampling. I would think that this is a good buy. But listen to it regardless. Listen to it regardless. One complaint.
Oh, what?
If you're listening to it on Spotify, it is mixed very shit. As in like the volumes of each track are nowhere matching each other. Like it's there's some songs where I would like raise the volume because it was so soft, and then I heard "Be All Right" come on, and it was just like holy fuck, like this is crazy. So they did a shitty job putting this on MP3, but you know what? It wasn't made for MP3.
It for sure was made on vinyl. Listen to it analogically, y'all. You know what I mean? Go experience that as if they were playing it right in front of you. But
Yep.
you know, that's the Rap Geeks.
Nope. We are the Funk
Funk
Geeks.
Geeks. Keep it funky, y'all. We just keeping it funky in this earth. That was Zapp, the first album by Zapp and Roger. This is the Funk Geeks. Thank y'all. Thank y'all for tuning in to Playback Appeal, and thank you for keep watching us or listening to us. We appreciate you. Sean, let talk to these motherfuckers, man.
Thank you all very much. We love it when you guys subscribe.
Yeah, all of
and
that.
hit the like
Hit
button.
that like button. You know what I mean?
This is the Funk Geeks signing out.
Playback, playback, playback.